The carriage wheels stopped outside Marlowe House before the sun had even fully risen, and Charlotte knew at once that something was wrong. No letter had come. No servant had ridden ahead to announce her husband's return. Edmund never arrived without warning, not since the day he had married her, not in 9 years of marriage. Yet here he was, stepping down from a carriage that was not his own, his coat dusted with the grime of a long road, his face pale in a way she had never seen before. Charlotte stood at the top of the stone steps with her hands folded in front of her, the cold morning air biting through her shawl. Behind her, she heard the soft shuffle of the household staff gathering in the entrance hall, drawn by the sound of hooves and wheels on gravel. She did not turn to look at them. She kept her eyes on her husband, and on the carriage door that had not yet opened. "Edmund," she said, her voice steady, though her heart had begun to beat faster. "You did not send word." "There was no time," he said. He did not meet her eyes. That alone told her more than his words did. He reached back toward the carriage and offered his hand to someone still seated inside. Charlotte's breath caught. A woman's gloved fingers closed around his, and a moment later, a figure stepped down into the pale morning light. She wore a traveling cloak of deep green, the hood drawn up over her head, but even shadowed as she was, Charlotte could see she was young, younger than herself by some years, and she carried herself with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being looked at. The household staff behind Charlotte fell silent. Even the birds in the hedgerows seemed to still. "Who is this?" Charlotte asked, though a cold certainty was already forming in her chest, a certainty she did not want to name. Edmund straightened his shoulders, the way he always did before delivering unwelcome news to his tenants or his creditors. "This is Miss Isabel Grant," he said, "a relation of my late aunt. She has fallen on difficult circumstances and will be staying with us for a time." Charlotte studied the woman's face as the hood slipped back an inch, revealing dark hair pinned loosely beneath a traveling bonnet, and eyes that would not quite meet her own. There was something in the way Isabel held herself, something too careful, too rehearsed, that told Charlotte this introduction had been practiced on the road, perhaps more than once, until it sounded almost natural. It was not natural. Nothing about this morning was natural. "A relation," Charlotte repeated. "I do not recall my husband's aunt having any family by the name of Grant." "She was a relation by marriage," Edmund said quickly, too quickly. "It is a complicated history. I will explain everything once we are inside." Charlotte glanced past him, past the woman in green, to the servants gathered at the base of the steps. Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, stood with her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white. Simmons, the butler, kept his gaze fixed somewhere over Charlotte's shoulder, refusing to look directly at any of them. They knew, or if they did not know the whole truth, they knew enough to understand that whatever was happening was not what Edmund claimed it to be. Charlotte felt the heat rise in her face, not from embarrassment, but from a slow, building fury she had learned long ago to keep hidden behind a calm expression. She had suspected for years. There had been late returns from London, unexplained expenses, a certain distance in her husband's manner that had crept in sometime after their second son was born and had never fully left. She had told herself it was the pressures of the estate, the demands of his title, the natural cooling that came to every marriage after enough years had passed. She had told herself many things. Standing here now, looking at the woman her husband had brought to her own front door, she understood that she had been telling herself lies to avoid a truth that was standing directly in front of her, wearing a green traveling cloak and refusing to meet her eyes. "Welcome to Marlowe House, Miss Grant," Charlotte said, and her voice did not shake. She was proud of that, distantly, the way one is proud of holding a heavy weight for longer than expected. "I hope your journey was not too tiring." Isabel's eyes flicked up at last, surprised, perhaps, by the courtesy in Charlotte's tone. "You are very kind, Your Grace," she said quietly. Her voice was softer than Charlotte had expected, almost apologetic, though for what exactly Charlotte could not yet say. "Simmons will show you to a room," Charlotte continued, turning to the butler, who startled slightly at being addressed. "The blue chamber on the east wing should do well enough for now." "Yes, Your Grace," Simmons said, relief plain on his face at being given a task, something ordinary to do with his hands while the extraordinary unfolded around him. Edmund watched this exchange with an expression Charlotte could not quite read, something between gratitude and wariness, as though he had expected a scene and did not know what to make of its absence. He did not yet understand that the absence of a scene was not mercy. It was patience. Charlotte had learned patience the hard way, through years of small disappointments swallowed quietly, and she intended to spend that patience carefully now, like a woman counting coins she could not afford to waste. As the staff dispersed to attend to the luggage and the horses, and Isabel was led inside by a young maid named Grace. Charlotte remained on the steps with her husband, the two of them alone for the first time since his return. "You will explain this to me," Charlotte said, her voice low. "Not the story you told the servants, the truth." Edmund's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the door where Isabel had disappeared, then back to his wife. "Not here," he said. "Not where anyone might hear." "Then where, Edmund? You have brought a stranger into our home and asked me to lie to our own household about who she is. I think I have earned the truth, wherever you wish to give it to me." "Tonight," he said, "after the children are asleep, I will tell you everything." "Everything," Charlotte repeated, testing the word, weighing whether she believed it. "Everything," he said again, and for the first time that morning, he looked directly into her eyes. What she saw there was not the guilt of a man caught in an affair, though there was guilt enough. There was something else beneath it, something closer to fear. Charlotte had known her husband to be proud, sometimes cold, occasionally thoughtless in the way that men of his station were bred to be thoughtless. She had never known him to be afraid. That frightened her more than the woman in green ever could. She turned and walked back into the house without another word, her skirts sweeping across the stone steps, her spine straight as a rod. Inside, the entrance hall smelled of beeswax and fresh flowers, the same as it always did, the same careful order she had maintained for 9 years as mistress of this house. She paused at the base of the great staircase and looked up toward the east wing, where somewhere behind a closed door, a woman half her husband's age was unpacking a trunk in a room meant for house guests, playing the role of a distant relation in a story that Charlotte was quite certain neither of them yet fully understood. Upstairs, her 2 sons would soon be waking for their lessons, unaware that anything in their world had shifted. Charlotte envied them that ignorance, briefly, fiercely, before pushing the feeling away. She had a household to run and a husband's secrets to uncover, and she would do both without letting her composure crack in front of the servants who depended on her steadiness to know how to feel about whatever was happening in this house. She sent word to the nursery that she would come up shortly, then stepped into the small parlor she used for her correspondence, closing the door behind her. Only then, alone, did she allow herself to sit, to press her palm flat against the cool wood of her writing desk, and to breathe. She thought of the early years of their marriage, when Edmund had still written her letters from London describing the color of the sky over the river, or the way a particular piece of music had reminded him of her laugh. Those letters were kept in a small box at the bottom of her wardrobe, tied with a faded ribbon, and she had not looked at them in a long while. She wondered now whether the man who wrote them had ever truly existed, or whether he had simply been a performance, much like the story he had given the servants that morning about a distant cousin fallen on hard times. A soft knock came at the parlor door, and Mrs. Whitfield entered, her expression carefully neutral in the way that only a housekeeper of long experience could manage. "Your Grace," she said, "shall I have tea sent up, or would you prefer to take it with the young masters in the nursery?" Charlotte considered the question longer than it deserved, grateful for a moment where the only decision required of her was one of tea and children. "The nursery," she said. "I find I would like to see my sons just now." Mrs. Whitfield hesitated at the door, and Charlotte, who had known the woman since before her own wedding, recognized the particular stillness of someone with something to say, and no permission to say it. "Is there something you wish to tell me, Mrs. Whitfield?" "Only that the young lady's trunk bore a traveling label from Bath, Your Grace," the housekeeper said carefully. "Not from wherever His Grace's late aunt kept her people. I thought you would wish to know, though I cannot say what it means." Charlotte held the housekeeper's gaze for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "You may go." When the door closed again, Charlotte sat very still, turning the small fact over in her mind like a coin. Bath. Not the north, where Edmund's aunt had lived out her final years. Bath, where fashionable people went to take the waters and to be seen, where a man might easily keep an acquaintance without his wife ever hearing whispers of it in the country. It was a small detail, and perhaps it meant nothing at all. But Charlotte had learned that the truth often arrived first in small details, long before anyone was brave enough to speak it aloud. She had spent 9 years building a life around this man, this house, these children. She would not watch it dismantled by a secret he was too cowardly to speak aloud in the light of day. Through the window, she could see Edmund still standing in the drive, watching the carriage being led away toward the stables, his shoulders bowed under some weight she could not yet name. For a moment, she almost pitied him. Then she remembered the careful way Isabel had avoided her eyes, the rehearsed quality of Edmund's explanation, the fear she had seen in her husband's face, and the pity dissolved into something harder, something that would carry her through the long hours until nightfall, when he had promised her the truth. She intended to hold him to that promise, whatever it cost either of them. Night came slowly to Marlowe House, the way it always did in autumn, the light draining from the sky in long amber streaks before settling into a darkness that pressed against the windows. Charlotte had spent the day performing the ordinary rituals of her position, overseeing the kitchen accounts, sitting with her sons over their lessons, walking the garden paths with a calm she did not feel, all while a single thought circled endlessly through her mind. Bath. A trunk from Bath, and a story about a relation from the north that did not match. By the time the boys were tucked into their beds and the house had settled into its evening quiet, Charlotte's patience had worn thin as old lace. She found Edmund in his study, standing near the cold fireplace with a glass of brandy untouched in his hand, staring at nothing in particular. "You promised me the truth tonight," she said, closing the door behind her. "I have waited all day for it. I will not wait any longer." Edmund set the glass down on the mantel with a small, precise click, as though even that simple motion required great control. "Sit down, Charlotte." "I would rather stand." He studied her for a moment, then nodded, accepting that she would not be managed tonight the way she had allowed herself to be managed on so many other nights, smoothing over small hurts for the sake of peace in the household. "Very well," he said. "I will tell you what I should have told you months ago." He began slowly, as though each word had to be pried loose from somewhere deep and reluctant. Isabel Grant was not, in fact, any relation to his late aunt. He had known her for nearly 3 years, since a chance meeting in Bath during a visit to consult a physician about his mother's failing health. What had begun as a passing acquaintance had, over time, become something else, something he did not attempt to dress up in kinder words for Charlotte's benefit. He did not deny what he had done. He did not offer excuses for the years of quiet dishonesty. Charlotte, standing rigid near the window, found herself grateful for that much at least. She had feared he would try to talk his way around the truth, the way he talked his way around difficult tenants and unhappy creditors. Instead, he simply stood there and let the truth sit heavy in the room between them. "Then why," Charlotte said, when she trusted her voice to remain steady, "would you bring her here, to our home? Did you imagine I would simply accept her presence, accept a lie told to my own servants, and continue as though nothing had changed?" "No," Edmund said. "I did not imagine that. I hoped for it, perhaps, in some cowardly corner of my mind, but I did not truly believe you would accept it easily. I brought her here because I had no other choice left to me, not one that did not risk far worse than her presence under this roof." "Explain that to me," Charlotte said. "Because from where I stand, Edmund, I cannot imagine anything worse than what you have already done." Edmund crossed to his desk and opened the top drawer, withdrawing a folded letter that had clearly been read and reread many times, its edges soft from handling. He held it out to her, and after a moment's hesitation, Charlotte took it. The letter was from a man named Josiah Kent, a name Charlotte did not recognize, and it was written in a hand both careful and threatening in its formality. It spoke of debts, of certain private matters concerning Isabel Grant that, if made public, would ruin not only her reputation but expose financial arrangements between herself and Edmund that stretched back years, arrangements that touched on funds drawn from the estate itself, funds that belonged, by law and by right, to Charlotte's own sons. Charlotte read the letter twice before she trusted herself to speak. "You used the estate's money," she said slowly, "to support her." "Some of it, yes," Edmund admitted, and to his credit, he did not look away from her as he said it. "Not so much that it endangered the boy's inheritance, I swear that to you, but enough that if this man Kent makes good on his threat to expose the arrangement publicly, it will not only ruin Isabel, it will bring scrutiny onto every transaction I have made in the last 3 years. It will bring scrutiny onto this family, onto our sons' futures, onto the Marlowe name itself." "And your solution," Charlotte said, her voice sharpening now, "was to bring the woman into our house and hide her here, under my own roof, under a lie you asked our servants to believe?" "Kent believes she has fled abroad," Edmund said. "If she disappears from where he expects to find her, and reappears nowhere he can trace, his threat loses its power. He cannot expose an arrangement he cannot prove is still active. Here, under a false name, protected by the standing of this house, she is safer than anywhere else I could place her. And so, I believed, are we." Charlotte set the letter down on the desk with great care, as though it might shatter if handled roughly, though what she truly wished was to fling it into the cold fireplace and watch it burn. "You did not think to ask me before making this decision. You did not think I deserved to know what was being risked in my own home, with my own children sleeping upstairs. I was afraid. Edmund said quietly. Afraid that if I told you the whole truth before acting, you would refuse to let her set foot here, and rightly so. And I did not know what else to do, Charlotte. I still do not know what else to do. I have come to you now, tonight, because I have run out of other paths to walk. I am asking you, not commanding you, whether you will allow her to remain, at least until I can find a way to satisfy Kent and remove this danger from our lives entirely. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Charlotte looked at her husband for a long moment, seeing him now not as the composed and sometimes distant duke she had lived beside for 9 years, but as a frightened man who had made a grave error and compounded it with silence, and who was now, for perhaps the first time in their marriage, placing a decision entirely in her hands. If I refuse, she said, what becomes of her? I do not know, Edmund admitted. I have no other safe place to send her on such short notice. If Kent finds her exposed and unprotected, I fear what he might do, both to her and to what remains of my own reputation, which is now tangled with hers whether either of us wishes it to be. Charlotte turned toward the window, looking out at the dark shapes of the garden hedges below, thinking not of Isabel Grant or of the threatening letter, but of her sons asleep upstairs, of the life she had built within these walls, brick by careful brick, year after year. She thought of the years she had spent turning her attention away from small signs, because facing them directly had seemed too costly. She would not turn away again, not tonight. I will allow her to stay, Charlotte said finally, and she heard Edmund release a breath he had clearly been holding. But you will understand the terms of this arrangement clearly, Edmund, and you will not mistake my agreement for forgiveness, nor for consent to continue as you have. Name your terms, he said. Whatever they are, I will agree to them. She will occupy the position given to her, that of a distant relation, in full, at every hour, in front of every member of this household, without exception. You will not visit her chamber. You will not seek her out privately, while she remains under this roof. If I discover that this arrangement has become a cover for anything beyond what you have described to me tonight, I will end it myself, whatever the cost to your reputation or hers. Agreed, Edmund said. And you will tell me everything, from this point forward, about this man Kent, about the money that was spent, about every step you intend to take to resolve this danger. I will not be kept in a room down the hall while you decide the fate of this family without me. Agreed, he said again, and this time there was something almost like relief in his voice, as though he had expected far harsher terms and had braced himself to receive them. Charlotte studied him a moment longer, this man she had married for reasons that felt, tonight, both foolish and inevitable, and she found that her anger had not left her. Not truly, but it had settled into something more useful, something she could carry forward rather than simply endure. One more thing, she said. You will tell her the terms yourself. I will not be the one to explain to a stranger in my home what she may and may not do under my roof. That burden belongs to you. Edmund nodded, and for the first time since his return that morning, something like steadiness returned to his shoulders, the posture of a man who had been given, however narrowly, a path forward rather than only the certainty of ruin. Charlotte left the study without another word, walking the quiet corridors of her home past the closed door of the blue chamber where Isabel Grant now slept, or perhaps lay awake, in a house full of strangers who did not yet know her true circumstances. Charlotte did not pause at the door. She did not yet know what she felt toward the woman inside, whether pity or resentment or something more complicated that had no simple name. She only knew that tomorrow would require of her a composure greater than any she had yet shown, and that the true test of tonight's agreement had not yet begun. Before she reached her own chamber, Charlotte stopped, turned back, and knocked softly on the door of the blue chamber. A moment passed before it opened, and Isabel stood there in a plain dressing gown, her dark hair loosened from its pins, looking younger and far less composed than she had appeared that morning on the drive. Your Grace, Isabel said, startled, drawing the door only partway open. I did not expect. May I come in for a moment? Charlotte said. It was not truly a question, though she had made an effort to phrase it as one. Isabel stepped aside, and Charlotte entered the room, taking in the half-unpacked trunk, the single candle burning low on the writing table, the general disarray of a woman who had clearly not expected to be settled here for any length of time. It was not the room of someone comfortable in her deception. I have spoken with my husband, Charlotte said, choosing her words with care. I understand something of the danger you are both attempting to avoid. I will not pretend to you that I have made peace with your presence in this house, because I have not, and I do not expect to. Not soon. But I wish to speak with you directly, rather than allow you to hear the terms of your stay secondhand. filtered through his account of what he believes I said. Isabel's hands twisted together in front of her. I am sorry, Your Grace. Truly. I did not wish to bring this trouble into your home. If there had been any other way— Was there another way? Charlotte asked, not unkindly, though the question carried an edge she did not try to soften. Or did you and my husband simply decide, between the two of you, that my home was the most convenient place to hide from a danger of your own making? Isabel was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its practiced smoothness. I did not ask him to bring me here. I told him it was a mistake, but he would not hear of leaving me anywhere Kent might find me, and I confess, Your Grace, I was frightened enough that I did not argue as hard as I should have. Charlotte studied the younger woman's face, searching for the calculation she had expected to find there, the confidence of a woman secure in her position. She found instead something closer to exhaustion, the look of someone who had spent a long time being frightened and had grown weary of it without finding any relief. What manner of man is this Kent, Charlotte asked, that both of you fear him so completely? He is not a man who makes idle threats, Isabel said quietly. I have known him longer than I have known your husband. He does not forget a debt, and he does not forgive one either. Charlotte absorbed this without comment, filing it away alongside the other fragments of the story she had gathered that evening. You will understand, she said at last, that I have agreed to allow you to remain here only under strict conditions, and only until this danger has passed. You will conduct yourself as the relation you are claimed to be, in full view of this household, at all times. My husband has agreed to the same discipline. I expect no less from you. I understand, Your Grace, Isabel said, and there was something in her tone, relief perhaps, or gratitude, that Charlotte chose not to examine too closely. I will not give you cause for complaint. I only wish to see this resolved, and to trouble your family no longer than necessary. Charlotte nodded once, and turned toward the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. I do not know yet what I think of you, Miss Grant, she said. I do not know whether to consider you a woman, caught in circumstances beyond her control, or a willing partner in the deception that has been done to me. Perhaps, given time, I will learn which is closer to the truth. Until then, we will both simply have to endure this house together. She left the room without waiting for a reply, closing the door softly behind her, and made her way at last to her own chamber, where she sat by the window for a long while, before sleep finally found her, watching the dark garden below, thinking of debts and letters and a name, Josiah Kent, that she now carried alongside her husband's, a shadow that had followed him home, and settled, uninvited, into the quiet order of her life. A week passed at Marlowe House, and to any visitor who might have called, everything would have appeared perfectly ordinary. Miss Isabel Grant took her meals with the family, walked the garden paths in the mild autumn light, and spoke with careful politeness to the servants who attended her. But beneath the surface of that ordinary week, tension moved through the house like a current beneath still water, felt by everyone, though spoken of by no one. Charlotte watched it all with the sharp attention of a woman, determined to miss nothing. She noted the way Edmund kept his distance from Isabel at the dinner table, addressing her with the same formal courtesy he extended to any distant relation, never once slipping into familiarity, exactly as he had promised. She noted, too, the way Isabel's eyes sometimes followed the two Ashworth boys as they ran through the halls, a wistfulness in her expression that Charlotte could not quite account for, until she considered that Isabel herself had likely never known the security of a settled home, the kind that came with a lawful marriage and children who bore their father's name without question. It was young Grace, the maid assigned to attend Isabel's chamber, who brought Charlotte the next piece of the puzzle, though she did not intend to bring trouble by it. Your Grace, Grace said one afternoon, finding Charlotte in the small parlor where she managed the household accounts. I do not mean to speak out of turn, but I thought you ought to know. Miss Grant has been writing letters, several each day, though she burns most of them before they are finished, as though she cannot decide what to say. Charlotte set down her pen. Do you know to whom she writes? I could not say for certain, Your Grace. I have seen no direction on the pages I have found in the grate, only fragments. But yesterday I found a name written and crossed out several times. Kent. Charlotte felt a small chill move through her. Thank you, Grace. You did well to tell me. That evening, after the boys had gone to bed and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, Charlotte sought out Isabel in the small sitting room adjoining the blue chamber, where the younger woman had taken to spending her evenings with a book she rarely seemed to read more than a page of at a time. You have been writing to him, Charlotte said, without preamble, closing the door behind her. To Kent. Isabel's face drained of color. Your Grace, I can explain. Then explain quickly. Because if you have given that man any indication of where you are hiding, you have placed this entire household in danger, not only yourself. I have not told him where I am, Isabel said quickly. I swear it. I have written to him only to try to reason with him, to offer him what little money remains to my own name, to beg him to let the matter rest. I have burned every letter before sending it, because each time I write it, I realize how foolish the attempt sounds, how little chance I have of reasoning with a man like him. Charlotte studied her carefully, searching for the lie in her expression, but found instead something that looked very much like desperation. Why would you attempt such a thing without telling either myself or my husband? Because I am tired of being a burden passed between other people's decisions, Isabel said, and for the first time since her arrival, her carefully maintained composure cracked entirely, revealing the raw frustration beneath it. Your husband decided to bring me here. You decided the terms under which I would stay. I have had no voice in any of it, Your Grace, though it is my life that Kent threatens to destroy. I only wished, for once, to attempt something of my own choosing, even if it came to nothing. The admission struck Charlotte harder than she expected. She had spent the past week viewing Isabel primarily as a problem to be managed, a consequence of her husband's failures that had been deposited, uninvited, into her home. She had not fully considered that Isabel, too, was a woman with little control over the shape of her own circumstances, caught between a man who had used her affections for years and a danger that threatened to consume whatever remained of her reputation and safety. You must stop, Charlotte said, though her voice had lost some of its sharpness. Whatever your intentions, any correspondence with Kent risks revealing far more than you intend. If he suspects you are settled somewhere stable enough to negotiate from, he will only press harder, believing you have resources to draw upon. I know that, Isabel said quietly. I have known it each time I have burned the letters instead of sending them. I only wished I had some other path forward, besides waiting in this room for other people to decide my fate. Charlotte sat down across from her, an action that surprised them both, given the distance she had maintained since Isabel's arrival. Tell me about him, she said, truly, not the fragments Edmund gave me, but what you know of him yourself. And so, over the next hour, Isabel told her. She spoke of meeting Kent years before she had ever encountered Edmund, of a business arrangement that had gone poorly and left her indebted to him in ways that had grown more complicated with each passing year. She spoke of how her connection to Edmund had begun as a means of financial security during a difficult period, and how, over time, it had become something she could no longer easily untangle, not because she loved him in any deep or lasting way, but because the entanglement itself had become its own kind of trap. I do not ask you to feel sympathy for me, Your Grace, Isabel said at the end of her account. I know the wrong I have done you, whether I intended it or not. I only wished you to understand that I did not arrive at this circumstance by careless choice alone. Charlotte considered this for a long while before responding. I cannot say that I forgive you, she said finally. That is not a gift I am prepared to give tonight, perhaps not for a long while yet. But I begin to understand that the anger I carry belongs more rightly to my husband than to you, and I will try to remember that distinction as this arrangement continues. It was, perhaps, the closest thing to peace the two women had yet found between them, and it did not last the week. 3 days later, a visitor arrived at Marlowe House unannounced, a circumstance that had become uncomfortably familiar in recent days. But this time it was not Edmund's carriage that rolled up the drive. It was a hired coach, plain and unmarked, and from it stepped a man Charlotte had never seen before, tall and narrow-shouldered, dressed in the manner of a prosperous tradesman rather than a gentleman, with sharp eyes that swept across the front of the house as though calculating its worth. Simmons announced him at the door with evident unease. A Mr. Kent, Your Grace, asking to speak with His Grace on a matter of business. Charlotte felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet, though she did not let it show on her face. Edmund was away that afternoon, visiting a tenant farm at the far edge of the estate, and would not return for hours yet. His Grace is not at home, Charlotte said, meeting the visitor's gaze directly as he stood in the entrance hall, his hat still in his hands, his eyes moving with unsettling patience over the furnishings and the staircase behind her. Perhaps you would care to leave a message, and I will see that it reaches him. Perhaps I would care to wait, Kent said, his voice smooth in a way that reminded Charlotte unpleasantly of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, through patience rather than force. I have traveled some distance, Your Grace, and I believe His Grace will wish to see me the moment he returns. It concerns a matter of some delicacy. A missing acquaintance of mine, who I have reason to believe may have found her way into more comfortable circumstances than I last knew of. Charlotte kept her expression perfectly composed, though her heart had begun to race. I am afraid I do not know what you mean, Mr. Kent. Perhaps not, Kent said, his eyes drifting once more toward the staircase, toward the closed doors of the upper floor, where, Charlotte knew with sudden dread, Isabel was likely seated in her sitting room, entirely unaware of who had just arrived beneath the same roof. "I am a patient man, Your Grace. I am content to wait in your excellent parlor until His Grace returns, however long that may take." Charlotte had no lawful means to refuse him entrance, not without raising precisely the sort of suspicion she had spent the past week trying to avoid. And so, with a composure that cost her more than she would ever let this stranger see, she gestured toward the front parlor. "Of course, Mr. Kent. Please, make yourself comfortable. I will have tea sent in while you wait." As she led him toward the parlor, her mind raced ahead of her measured steps, already calculating how she might warn Isabel without alerting the servants, how she might keep this dangerous man occupied and unsuspicious until Edmund returned, and how, if the worst came to pass and Kent discovered the truth beneath her roof this very afternoon, she would manage to protect not only Isabel but her own sons from whatever consequences followed. Kent settled into the chair by the window, the one Charlotte usually favored for her afternoon reading, and looked about the room with the unhurried interest of a man appraising property he half expected to own one day. "A fine house," he said. "Finer than I expected, if I am honest, Your Grace. His Grace has done well for himself." "The estate has been in his family for 4 generations, Charlotte said, taking a seat across from him with a stillness she did not feel. "I imagine you did not travel this distance merely to admire the architecture, Mr. Kent." A thin smile crossed his face, the smile of a man who appreciated directness even when it worked against him. "No, Your Grace. I confess I did not. I mentioned a missing acquaintance, a young woman of my prior acquaintance, connected in certain financial matters that remain, shall we say, unresolved. I had reason to believe His Grace might know something of her whereabouts given their own long acquaintance. I know nothing of my husband's business dealings beyond the management of this estate," Charlotte said, which was, she reflected, no longer entirely true, though she said it with perfect steadiness. "You would do better to raise the matter directly with him when he returns." "I intend to," Kent said. "But I find, Your Grace, that houses often speak more honestly than the people who live in them. A household staff of this size, for instance, cannot easily conceal the presence of a guest, however discreetly that guest is introduced. Servants gossip. Tradesmen deliver goods to particular rooms and remember the details. I have found, in my line of work, that the truth of a household is rarely as well hidden as its master believes." Charlotte felt a cold weight settle in her chest at his words, but she kept her expression unmoved. "This house has no guests at present beyond the ordinary comings and goings of family business, Mr. Kent. I am afraid your journey may prove disappointing." At that moment, the parlor door opened, and Grace entered with the tea tray, setting it down with the careful precision of a well-trained servant, though Charlotte caught the flicker of nervousness in the girl's eyes as she glanced toward the unfamiliar visitor. Charlotte poured the tea herself, a task she rarely performed without the assistance of staff, using the ordinary motion to steady her own hands and to buy herself a moment to think. "You seem a very thorough man, Mr. Kent," she said, handing him his cup. "I imagine such thoroughness serves you well in your business affairs." "It has served me well enough," Kent agreed, accepting the cup with a slight incline of his head, "though I find that thoroughness sometimes reveals uncomfortable truths even to myself. I did not travel here expecting a warm welcome, Your Grace. I traveled here expecting to find what I came looking for, welcome or not." The conversation continued in this manner for the better part of an hour, Kent probing with careful, indirect questions about the household's recent activities, the frequency of visitors, the contents of recent deliveries from town, while Charlotte deflected each inquiry with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years managing difficult conversations at dinner parties and county gatherings. But beneath her composed exterior, her mind worked constantly at the problem of Isabel, seated somewhere above them in her sitting room, entirely unaware that the very danger she had fled now sat drinking tea in the front parlor. At the first opportunity, when Kent's attention drifted briefly toward the window and the view of the drive beyond, Charlotte rose. "You must excuse me a moment, Mr. Kent. I wish to see that a room is prepared, should you need to wait for my husband's return past the dinner hour. Grace will keep you company and refresh your tea." Kent inclined his head, unbothered, and Charlotte left the parlor at a measured pace, forcing herself not to hurry until she was well out of sight of the doorway. Then she climbed the stairs quickly, her skirts gathered in one hand, and made her way directly to Isabel's sitting room, knocking twice before letting herself in without waiting for a reply. Isabel looked up from her book, startled by the urgency in Charlotte's expression. "Your Grace, what has happened?" "Kent is here," Charlotte said quietly, closing the door behind her. Downstairs, in the parlor, waiting for Edmund to return. You must not leave this room under any circumstance until I send word that it is safe. Lock the door behind me, and do not answer it unless you hear my voice or my husband's." Isabel's face went pale, her hands trembling as she set down her book. "How did he find me? I told no one where I had gone. I swear it, Your Grace. I have sent no letters that named this house." "I do not know how he found this place," Charlotte said, "but he has not yet confirmed you are here, only that he suspects it. I intend to keep it that way until my husband returns and we can decide together how best to handle him. Stay here. Stay silent. I will send Grace with word the moment it is safe to move." Isabel nodded, too frightened for further words, and Charlotte left the room, waiting until she heard the small click of the lock turning before she made her way back down the stairs, composing her expression once more into the careful neutrality that had carried her through the past hour, and would need to carry her through however many more remained before Edmund's return. She rejoined Kent in the parlor and steered the conversation toward safer ground, asking after his journey, his impressions of the countryside, anything that might keep his attention away from the closed doors above. He answered pleasantly enough, though his eyes retained that same patient watchfulness, as though he were content to let the afternoon stretch on for as long as necessary. Charlotte poured a second round of tea and spoke of the weather, of the harvest, of nothing at all, while every part of her strained toward the sound of carriage wheels on the drive. They came at last, nearly 2 hours after Kent's arrival, the familiar rhythm of horses and wheels rolling up toward the front steps. Charlotte rose at once, relief and dread mingling in equal measure, and excused herself to greet her husband at the door before he could walk unwarned into the parlor. Edmund's expression shifted the moment he saw her face in the entrance hall. "Charlotte, what is it?" "He is here," she said quietly, glancing toward the parlor door. "Kent, he arrived an hour past, asking after a missing acquaintance. He has not yet found her, but he suspects Edmund. He asked pointed questions about visitors and deliveries, and I do not know how much longer I can hold him off without either confirming his suspicions or arousing greater ones." Edmund's face hardened into an expression Charlotte had rarely seen, something between fear and grim resolve. "Where is Isabel?" "Locked in her sitting room, and there she will stay until we decide what is to be done." Charlotte caught her husband's arm before he could move toward the parlor. "Edmund, listen to me. However you handle this man, you will not do it alone. Whatever is said in that room, I intend to be present for it." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he nodded once. "Together, then." They walked toward the parlor side by side, and Charlotte felt, despite everything, a strange and unexpected steadiness in the fact that her husband had not argued, had not tried to send her away to manage this danger alone, as he had tried to manage so much else in recent weeks. Whatever came next, whatever Kent intended to demand or threaten, they would face it as they had promised each other on the night of Isabel's arrival, together, and with the truth finally laid bare between them. Kent rose from his chair as Edmund entered the parlor, setting down his teacup with unhurried precision, his expression giving away nothing of satisfaction or surprise. "Your Grace," he said, "I had begun to think I might have to wait until dinner." "Mr. Kent," Edmund said, his voice carefully level, though Charlotte, standing beside him, could feel the tension radiating from him, like heat from a struck flint. "I understand you have come a long way to speak with me." "I have," Kent said. "Regarding a matter we both understand, I believe, without needing to speak too plainly in front of the household staff." His eyes flicked briefly toward the door, where Grace had lingered a moment too long before Charlotte dismissed her with a small motion of her hand. Once the door had closed and the three of them stood alone in the parlor, Kent's manner shifted, the pleasant patience of the afternoon giving way to something harder and more direct. "I will not waste further time with pleasantries, Your Grace. I know Isabel is here. I have known it since I arrived, in truth, though I permitted your wife the courtesy of maintaining her fiction a while longer. A woman traveling from Bath, arriving unannounced at Marlowe House under a false name, the week after I last called upon her former lodgings and found her gone. It did not require great deduction." Charlotte felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her face composed, refusing to give this man the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Edmund's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. "What is it you want, Kent? Speak plainly, as you say, and let us be done with this game." "What I want," Kent said, "is what I have always wanted. The debt Isabel owes me, settled in full, along with a sum for my trouble in tracking her to your very doorstep. I am not an unreasonable man, Your Grace, but I am also not a patient one when I am made to feel foolish, and I have spent 3 weeks feeling exactly that. chasing rumors of a woman who has apparently been sheltering in a duke's household this entire time. And if I refuse, Edmund said, what then? You have made your threats before, in letters. I assume you intend to make good on them now. Kent smiled thinly. I intend to do whatever proves necessary, Your Grace. I could take this matter to the courts, though I suspect neither of us wishes the details of Isabel's arrangement with you laid bare before a magistrate. I could take it instead to certain newspapers, who I understand pay handsomely for stories involving noble households and hidden mistresses. Or I could simply be paid what I am owed and leave this house today, never to trouble any of you again. The choice, Your Grace, is entirely yours. Charlotte stepped forward before Edmund could answer, drawing both men's attention. You speak of payment as though it is a simple matter, Mr. Kent, but I think you have not fully considered your own position. You have arrived at a duke's household making threats against his family in front of witnesses. Should any harm come to Miss Grant, or should this matter become public through your own actions, you will find yourself facing consequences far greater than an unpaid debt. My husband commands considerable influence in this county and beyond it. I would think carefully before assuming this negotiation favors you as completely as you seem to believe. Kent's eyes moved to Charlotte with something like reassessment, the polite dismissiveness of earlier giving way to genuine attention. You are a formidable woman, Your Grace, I will grant you that. But threats work both directions. I have documents, letters exchanged between Isabel and His Grace, records of certain payments made from estate funds that I do not believe were properly accounted for in whatever ledgers His Grace's man of business maintains. Should this matter go badly for me, I assure you, it will go equally badly for this family's reputation. The room fell into a tense silence. Charlotte glanced at her husband, who stood with his hands clenched at his sides, his composure fraying at the edges despite his evident effort to maintain it. She understood, in that moment, that Edmund had reached the limit of his own resources for handling this situation, that the confidence he had shown in bringing Isabel here under a false story had never truly extended to a plan for confronting Kent directly, should it come to this. What sum, Charlotte asked before her husband could speak again, would satisfy this debt in full, along with whatever additional trouble you claim to have suffered? Kent named a figure, and Charlotte heard Edmund's sharp intake of breath beside her. It was a substantial sum, though not, she judged quickly, beyond the estate's capacity to bear if managed carefully over time. That is a considerable amount, Mr. Kent, Charlotte said. I do not believe my husband carries such a sum readily available in this house, nor would it be wise for him to attempt to gather it hastily in a manner that draws further attention to this matter. I am not asking for it this afternoon, Your Grace, Kent said, his tone suggesting he had expected this response. I am a reasonable man. I will allow a fortnight for the sum to be arranged, delivered to an address I will provide, and in exchange, I will consider the debt settled and this matter closed, with all documents concerning it destroyed, and no further contact made with either yourself or Miss Grant. And how are we to trust that your word holds any value? Edmund said, finding his voice at last, given the manner in which you have pursued this matter thus far. You are not required to trust me, Your Grace, Kent said. You are required only to weigh the cost of paying against the cost of not paying, and to make whatever decision serves your family best. I will return in a fortnight for my answer, one way or another. He collected his hat from where he had set it beside his chair, and moved toward the door, pausing only briefly as he passed Charlotte. You have a fine household, Your Grace. I would hate to see it suffer for a debt that was never yours to begin with. Consider that, when you counsel your husband on how best to proceed. The door closed behind him, and a long moment passed before either Charlotte or Edmund moved or spoke. Charlotte crossed to the window and watched the hired coach pull away down the drive, disappearing at last around the bend that led toward the main road, before she allowed herself to release the breath she had been holding. A fortnight, Edmund said quietly, sinking into the chair Kent had vacated. I do not know that I can raise such a sum in a fortnight without drawing the very attention we are trying to avoid. Then we must find another way, Charlotte said, turning from the window to face him. Paying him may satisfy this debt, Edmund, but it will not guarantee his silence forever. A man who has already broken his word once, threatening a household directly after implying he would wait for a private answer, is not a man whose promises hold much weight. If we pay him now, what prevents him from returning in a year's time, claiming some new grievance, some new sum required to keep his silence? Edmund rubbed a hand across his face, looking older in that moment than Charlotte had ever seen him. What would you have me do instead? I cannot simply ignore him and hope he loses interest. You heard what he claims to hold, letters, records of payment. If even a portion of that finds its way into public knowledge, It will not only ruin Isabel, it will follow our sons for the rest of their lives. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, turning the problem over in her mind with the same careful attention she gave to the household accounts each week, searching for the flaw in a column of figures that refused to balance. We need to know exactly what he holds, she said finally. Not what he claims to hold, but what actually exists. If his threat is built on documents that prove less damaging than he suggests, we may have more room to negotiate than he wishes us to believe, and we need to speak with Isabel again, properly this time, to learn everything she knows of this man's habits, his resources, his history of following through on threats he has made to others. You wish to investigate him, Edmund said, something almost like surprise in his voice. I wish to understand what we are truly facing, Charlotte said, rather than accepting his account of it simply because he delivered it with confidence. A man who relies on fear to extract payment often exaggerates the strength of his position. I do not say this is certainly the case with Kent, only that we owe it to this family to find out before we hand over a sum large enough to draw the attention of every creditor and gossip in the county. Edmund looked at his wife for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. A recognition, perhaps, of a strength in her he had underestimated across 9 years of marriage, or had simply stopped noticing amid the ordinary business of running a household and raising sons. Where would we even begin, he asked, to learn such things about a man like Kent? We begin, Charlotte said, by speaking with the one person in this house who has known him longest. Together they climbed the stairs toward the sitting room where Isabel had waited, alone and frightened, through the entire confrontation below. Charlotte knocked twice, spoke her own name softly through the door, and heard the lock turn a moment later. Isabel's face was pale and streaked with the marks of tears she had clearly tried to wipe away before opening the door, and her eyes went immediately to Edmund, searching his expression for some sign of how badly the encounter below had gone. He knows I am here, Isabel said, before either of them could speak. I heard enough through the floor to understand that much. He knows, Edmund confirmed, closing the door behind them. He has given us a fortnight to produce a sum of money, or he threatens to take his claims to the courts, or worse, to the newspapers. Isabel sank onto the small settee beneath the window, her hands pressed together in her lap. Then it is as I feared. I told you both, he does not relent once he believes he holds an advantage. We need to understand precisely what advantage he truly holds, Charlotte said, taking the chair across from her, while Edmund remained standing near the door, his arms crossed, watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. He spoke of letters between yourself and Edmund, and records of payments drawn from the estate. Are these documents real, Isabel, or does he merely claim them to frighten us into paying more readily? Isabel considered the question for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. There were letters, she admitted. Early in our acquaintance, before either of us understood how deeply I would come to owe him, I do not know how many he retained, or whether he kept copies of the financial arrangements as well. He is a careful man in his business dealings, Your Grace. I would not be surprised if he holds more than either of us would wish. And his history, Charlotte pressed. Has he made threats before, to others, that you know of? Has he ever followed through on such threats, or does he prefer the leverage of fear to the trouble of actually acting upon it? Isabel was quiet for a moment, thinking back. There was another matter, before I knew him well. A merchant's widow who owed him a smaller sum than mine. I heard, through others who knew them both, that he did indeed take the matter to a magistrate when she refused to pay, though the sum recovered was far less than the cost and difficulty of the proceedings themselves. I believe he did it more to prove a point to others who might consider refusing him than for any true profit in that particular case. Edmund exhaled slowly. So he is a man who will act on his threats, even at cost to himself, if it serves to protect his reputation for collecting what he believes he is owed. That is my understanding of him, yes, Isabel said, which is why I fled Bath in the first place, rather than attempt to negotiate directly. I did not believe reasoning with him would succeed, and events have proven me right in that much at least. Charlotte considered this new information carefully, weighing it against the confidence Kent had displayed in the parlor below. A man who acted on principle as much as profit was, in some ways, more predictable than one motivated by greed alone, but he was also less likely to be swayed by a partial payment or a clever negotiation. If Kent believed that yielding to Isabel, even slightly, would damage his standing with others who owed him money, he would press forward regardless of the cost to himself. There may be another approach, Charlotte said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke. If his primary concern is his reputation among those who owe him debts, perhaps the answer lies not in confronting him directly with money or threats of our own, but in removing his leverage entirely. If the documents he holds prove less damaging publicly than he suggests, revealing them ourselves on our own terms before he can use them as a weapon might strip away the very advantage he believes he holds. Edmund's expression shifted, alarm crossing his features. You cannot mean exposing the arrangement ourselves, Charlotte. That would ruin us as surely as anything Kent might do. Not exposing everything, Charlotte clarified, but perhaps enough to control the narrative ourselves, rather than allowing Kent to control it through fear and threat. A private acknowledgement to the right people, framed on our own terms, may cost us less than a public scandal delivered on his. Isabel looked between the two of them, uncertainty plain on her face. I do not wish to be the cause of further ruin to this family, Your Grace, whatever path you choose. I have already brought enough trouble to this house. You did not choose to be pursued by a man like Kent, Charlotte said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her own voice. Whatever role you played in the deception done to me, I do not believe you deserve to be sacrificed to protect the rest of us from consequences that Edmund's choices created as much as your own. Edmund looked at his wife with something like disbelief, though whether at her strategy or at the kindness she had extended to Isabel despite everything, Charlotte could not say. We have a fortnight, he said finally. Whatever path we choose, we must decide quickly, and we must decide together, all three of us, since it seems we are all bound to whatever consequences follow. Charlotte nodded, and for the first time since the carriage had arrived unannounced at her door a week before, she felt something other than anger or fear settle over the situation, a fragile sense of shared purpose among three people who had, until recently, been working against rather than alongside one another. Whether that fragile alliance would hold long enough to outmaneuver a man like Kent remained to be seen, but for the first time, Charlotte allowed herself to believe it might be possible. The days that followed passed in a strange rhythm of ordinary household routine, layered over frantic, quiet preparation. Charlotte spent her mornings with the boys, her afternoons managing the estate's accounts, and her evenings closeted with Edmund and Isabel, piecing together every scrap of information that might help them face Kent on more equal footing when the fortnight ended. It was on the 9th day, with the deadline drawing uncomfortably close, that everything changed. Charlotte had gone to Edmund's study that morning to discuss a letter that had arrived from his solicitor, a man they had cautiously brought into their confidence to review what legal protections the family might have should Kent make good on his threat to involve the courts. She found the study door ajar, and through the gap, she heard voices. Edmund's and another she recognized immediately, though it did not belong to Isabel. It was Edmund's cousin, Lord Henry Vane, a man Charlotte had never fully trusted, given his history of gambling debts and his frequent ill-timed requests for loans from Edmund over the years. She paused outside the door, unseen, and listened. You cannot expect me to simply forget what I overheard, Edmund, Henry was saying, his voice carrying the particular smugness of a man who believed he had discovered something valuable. A woman hidden in your household under a false name, a debt collector arriving at your door demanding payment. This is precisely the sort of story that could prove very costly to keep quiet, and very profitable to share, should the right people learn of it. Charlotte's blood ran cold. Henry had learned of the situation, somehow, perhaps from careless servants' talk in the village, perhaps from watching the house more closely than any of them had realized during his recent visit to discuss estate matters with Edmund. What is it you want, Henry? Edmund's voice was tired, the voice of a man who had already spent every reserve of patience on one threat, and now found himself facing a second. Only what I have asked of you before, Henry said, a more permanent arrangement regarding my allowance from the estate. You have always been reluctant to increase it, citing prudence, citing the boy's inheritance. I think, given what I now know, you might find yourself reconsidering that reluctance. Charlotte stepped into the doorway before she had fully decided to do so, unable to remain silent a moment longer. You would blackmail your own family, Henry, over a matter that does not concern you? Both men turned toward her, Edmund with something like relief at the interruption, Henry with the startled expression of a man caught in the act of a scheme he had not expected to be witnessed. Charlotte, Henry said, recovering his composure quickly, I did not realize you were involved in these delicate family discussions. I am involved in every matter that concerns this household, Charlotte said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her. Including, apparently, the character of the relations who visit it. You would threaten to expose a woman fleeing genuine danger and endanger my son's reputation along with hers, simply to line your own pockets further. I confess, Henry, I had thought better of you, though perhaps I ought not to have. Henry's face flushed, whether from shame or anger, Charlotte could not immediately tell. I do not see the harm in a family arrangement, Charlotte. Edmund has resources enough to spare a portion for a cousin who has always struggled where he has thrived. The harm, Charlotte said, is that you are attempting to extract that arrangement through threat rather than honest request, precisely because you believe we are already vulnerable to a separate danger and too distracted to refuse you as we have in the past. That is not family loyalty, Henry. That is opportunism dressed in a familiar coat. A tense silence followed her words, broken only when Edmund finally spoke. Charlotte is right, he said, rising from his desk. I will not be threatened twice in the same fortnight, Henry, not even by my own blood. Whatever you believe you have learned, I suggest you consider carefully before repeating it to anyone, because I promise you, the consequences of damaging this family's reputation will fall as heavily on you, as a relation associated with our name, as they would on any of us. Henry's bravado faltered slightly under the combined weight of their united front, and Charlotte watched something calculating shift behind his eyes, a man recalculating the odds of a scheme that had suddenly become more complicated than he had anticipated. I meant no true harm, he said finally, his tone shifting toward conciliation. I merely thought, given the circumstances, that a small increase in my allowance seemed a reasonable request. We will discuss your allowance at the appropriate time, through the appropriate channels, as we always have, Edmund said. Not as the price of your silence regarding a matter that does not concern you. Good day, Henry. It was, Charlotte reflected as Henry gathered his hat and departed with considerably less confidence than he had arrived with. A small victory, but a costly one. Whatever fragile secrecy they had maintained around Isabel's presence had now been breached by someone within the family itself, someone who might, despite his retreat today, decide in a weaker moment to sell the story elsewhere if his allowance was not eventually increased to his satisfaction. That evening, the three of them gathered once more, the weight of two threats now bearing down upon them instead of one. Isabel, informed of Henry's attempted blackmail, had grown increasingly withdrawn over the course of the day, and Charlotte found her that night not in the sitting room where she usually waited, but standing at the window of her chamber, staring out at the darkened garden below. I should leave, Isabel said, before Charlotte could speak. Tonight, if necessary. I have brought nothing but danger to this house since the moment I arrived, and now even your husband's own family threatens to use my presence against you. I cannot in good conscience remain and watch this family unravel further because of my circumstances. And go where? Charlotte asked, moving to stand beside her at the window. Back to Bath, where Kent will find you within days. You would only be trading one danger for a swifter version of the same danger, and you would face it entirely alone. Better alone than the cause of your family's ruin, Isabel said, her voice thick with an emotion Charlotte had not expected to see from her, something that looked very much like genuine grief rather than mere fear for her own safety. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, studying the profile of the woman beside her, a woman she had resented deeply only weeks before, and whom she found now, unexpectedly, that she did not wish to see cast out alone into whatever danger awaited her beyond these walls. I will tell you something, Isabel, that I have not yet said aloud to anyone, not even Edmund. When you first arrived at this house, I believed my greatest injury had been done to me by your presence, by the humiliation of learning my husband's betrayal in front of my own servants. I have come to understand in the weeks since that the injury was done long before you ever arrived here. It was done in every quiet evening Edmund spent away in Bath, in every excuse and every silence he offered instead of honesty. You did not create that betrayal. You were, in many ways, as trapped by the consequences of it as I have been. Isabel turned to face her, tears now openly falling. Why would you say such a thing to me, after everything? Because it is true, Charlotte said simply. And because I find that I would rather fight alongside you against the dangers now threatening this household than watch you walk out into the night to face them alone, simply because it would be easier for the rest of us to pretend the danger had left with you. It would not. Kent would still return in a fortnight, and Henry would still hold whatever knowledge he has gathered. Whether you remain under this roof or not, your leaving solves nothing. It only ensures that whatever comes next, you face it without any of the small protection this household can still offer you. The two women stood together at the window for a long while after that, saying little more, but the silence between them had shifted into something Charlotte had not expected to find with the woman her husband had once loved in secret. A fragile companionship born not of forgiveness exactly, but of shared circumstance, and a growing respect that had crept in unnoticed during the long, difficult days since Isabel's arrival. Downstairs, Edmund sat alone in his study long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, staring at the letter from his solicitor that Charlotte had never gotten the chance to discuss with him that morning. before Henry's threat had interrupted everything else. The solicitor's assessment was not encouraging. Kent's claims, if even partially substantiated by genuine documents, would prove difficult to dismiss entirely in any legal proceeding. And the reputational damage of a public dispute, regardless of its outcome, would linger over the family for years. There was only one path forward that the solicitor's letter seemed to suggest with any confidence, one that Edmund had been avoiding even considering since the fortnight began, because it required a kind of honesty he had spent years training himself to avoid. He would need to go to Kent directly, not with the full sum demanded, but with a counter-proposal built on the very strategy Charlotte had suggested days before, controlling the narrative themselves rather than allowing either Kent or Henry to control it through fear. It meant risking everything on the wife he had wronged and the mistress he had endangered standing beside him when the moment came, rather than working to protect each of them separately, as he had tried and failed to do since the day the carriage first arrived at Marlowe House. A soft knock came at the study door, and Charlotte entered without waiting for his answer, finding him still seated behind his desk, the solicitor's letter spread out before him in the low candlelight. She had not expected to find him awake at such an hour, and something in his expression, weary and uncertain in a way she rarely saw him allow himself to appear, softened the edge of the reserve she had maintained toward him since the morning of Isabel's arrival. "You have read the solicitor's letter," she said, taking the chair across from him without waiting to be asked. "I have," Edmund said. "It confirms what we feared. There is no clean legal path through this, not without risking exposure regardless of the outcome. He suggests, in careful language meant to avoid stating it outright, that the only real defense against a man like Kent is to remove his power before he can use it, precisely as you proposed." Charlotte studied her husband's face in the candlelight, seeing in it not the confident, sometimes distant duke she had married, but a man who had spent the better part of 2 weeks watching every careful arrangement of his life threaten to collapse around him. "You look as though you have not slept properly in days," she said. "I have not," he admitted. "I keep thinking of the boys, Charlotte, of what they will inherit, not only in land and title, but in reputation, if this matter is handled poorly. I keep thinking that whatever comes of it, the fault lies entirely with choices I made years before any of this began, choices that Isabel and Henry and even Kent himself are only now forcing into the light." "That is true," Charlotte said, without softening the observation, though her tone carried less anger in it than it might have a fortnight before. "But dwelling on fault will not resolve the danger in front of us. I did not come here tonight to extract further confession from you, Edmund. I came to tell you that I have spoken with Isabel, and that whatever course we choose to take with Kent, I believe she will stand with us rather than flee, provided we ask it of her honestly, and treat her as a partner in this, rather than merely a burden to be managed." Edmund looked at his wife with something like wonder. "You defend her now. A fortnight ago, you could barely look at her without your composure cracking. A fortnight ago, I understood her only as the shape of my own injury," Charlotte said. "I understand her differently now, as a woman who has been used by circumstance nearly as thoroughly as I have been, though in a different manner. That does not erase what you did, Edmund, or what she allowed to continue for longer than she perhaps should have. But it has taught me that anger, however justified, is not a strategy. It will not protect our sons, and it will not defeat a man like Kent." Edmund set down the solicitor's letter and rubbed his hands over his face. "What would you have us do then? You spoke before of controlling the narrative ourselves. What does that mean, practically, when the fortnight ends and Kent returns expecting either payment or ruin?" Charlotte had been turning the question over for days, refining the shape of an answer she had not yet dared to speak fully aloud, even to herself. "We do not deny what happened," she said slowly. "Not entirely. We acknowledge, privately, to the small circle of people whose opinion truly matters to this family's standing, that a financial arrangement existed between yourself and a woman, in difficult circumstances, one that has since been resolved honorably, with Isabel placed under this household's protection, rather than left to suffer the consequences of a debt that was never rightfully hers alone to bear. We frame it, Edmund, not as a scandal to be hidden, but as a matter already handled with discretion and responsibility by this family, before Kent ever arrived to threaten us with exposure." "You wish to tell the truth," Edmund said slowly, testing the idea as though it were an unfamiliar weight in his hands, "before Kent can tell his version of it." "A carefully chosen portion of the truth," Charlotte corrected, "delivered by us, on our terms, to the people whose good opinion actually matters, rather than left to spread as gossip and speculation, once Kent or Henry decide to profit from their knowledge of it. It will not be pleasant, Edmund, There will be those who judge you harshly, and perhaps judge me for standing beside you through it. But it removes the power both men currently hold over us, the power of secrecy itself. A secret can be weaponized. A fact already acknowledged, however uncomfortable, cannot be used as a threat in quite the same way. Edmund was silent for a long moment, considering the plan from every angle Charlotte could see reflected in his troubled expression. "It is a considerable risk," he said finally. "It is," Charlotte agreed, "but I have come to believe it is a smaller risk than continuing to pay whatever sum each new threat demands, only to face another demand a year from now, and another after that, for as long as the secret remains ours alone to protect. I would rather face one difficult season of judgment than a lifetime of fear, Edmund, and I believe, if we approach it together, all three of us, standing united rather than each trying to shield the others separately, we stand a far better chance of surviving it with something of this family's dignity intact." Edmund reached across the desk, an old habit from earlier, gentler years of their marriage, and covered her hand with his own. Charlotte did not pull away, though she did not fully return the gesture either, allowing it to rest there, a small and uncertain bridge between the anger she still carried and the partnership the coming days would require of them both. "Tomorrow," Edmund said, "we will speak with Isabel together, and with the solicitor, and begin preparing exactly how much truth we intend to offer, and to whom. If we are to face Kent on our own terms, we have little time left to prepare it properly." Charlotte nodded, rising from her chair, though she paused at the door and looked back at her husband, still seated in the low candlelight, looking older and more uncertain than she had ever known him to appear. "For whatever it is worth, Edmund," she said quietly, "I do not do this for your sake alone. I do it for our sons, and for the version of this family I still believe we can salvage from the wreckage of your choices. Do not mistake my partnership in this plan for anything more than that, not yet." "I would not dare," Edmund said, and there was something almost like gratitude in his voice, gratitude that she had not simply abandoned him to face the consequences of his own making, even as she made clear that her forgiveness remained a separate and far more distant question. For the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Edmund found himself hoping, rather than simply assuming, that both women in his life would choose to stand with him when the fortnight finally ended, and that whatever judgment awaited the family in the weeks ahead, it might yet be survived with something worth preserving, still intact on the other side of it. The remaining days of the fortnight passed with a purpose that had been absent from the household since Isabel's arrival. Edmund's solicitor visited twice more, drafting careful language that would form the basis of what the family intended to disclose, and to whom. Charlotte drew up a list of names, the county families whose opinions genuinely mattered to the Ashworth reputation, and considered each one carefully, weighing how much truth each relationship could bear, and still hold firm on the other side of it. Isabel, once she understood the shape of the plan, proved more useful than either Charlotte or Edmund had expected. She knew Kent's habits, his usual associates, and the particular vanity that drove him, a desire to be seen as a formidable man of business rather than merely a collector of debts. Together, the three of them began to construct not only a defense against his threat, but a strategy for the meeting itself, one that would leave him with far less leverage than he currently believed he held. Henry, for his part, made no further attempt at blackmail in the days that followed his confrontation with Charlotte and Edmund, though Charlotte remained watchful, aware that his silence might prove temporary rather than permanent, dependent entirely on how the larger matter with Kent resolved itself. On the appointed day, Kent's hired coach rolled up the drive precisely on schedule, and this time, Charlotte and Edmund received him together in the front parlor, with Isabel seated beside them rather than hidden away upstairs. Kent's eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of her, the first flicker of genuine surprise Charlotte had seen cross his careful expression since his first visit. "I see we have dispensed with the pretense," Kent said, settling into the chair he had occupied before, though his gaze moved between the three of them with new wariness, sensing correctly that something in the household's posture had shifted since their last meeting. "We have," Edmund said. "I will not waste your time or mine with further games, Mr. Kent. You came here seeking payment in exchange for your silence. I am prepared to offer you a settlement of the debt Isabel genuinely owes you, calculated fairly and without the additional sum you demanded for what you called your trouble in finding her. What I am not prepared to offer is continued payment against the implied threat of exposure, now or in the future." Kent's smile remained fixed, though something behind his eyes had grown more calculating. "And if I decline such a reduced offer, Your Grace, I hold documents that could prove considerably costly to your family's reputation, regardless of how reasonable you believe your counteroffer to be." "You may hold them," Charlotte said, speaking for the first time since Kent's arrival. "But I would ask you to consider what value they truly retain, given that this family intends to disclose the substance of this arrangement ourselves, to the people whose opinion matters to us, before the week is out." A letter written in confidence between two people, revealed by a debt collector seeking payment, carries a very different weight than a matter already acknowledged honestly by the family involved. "I do not believe your documents will find the eager audience you currently imagine, Mr. Kent, once the surprise you intend to deliver with them has already been spoken aloud by the very people you hope to threaten." Kent's composure faltered, just slightly, the first genuine crack Charlotte had seen in his carefully maintained confidence since he had first stepped through the door of Marlowe House. "You would ruin your own family's reputation, Your Grace, merely to spite me?" "We would control our own reputation," Charlotte corrected, "rather than allow you or anyone else to control it on our behalf. There is a considerable difference, Mr. Kent, between a scandal exposed by an enemy and a difficult truth acknowledged honestly by the family it concerns. Society forgives the latter far more readily than the former, particularly when the family in question has clearly taken responsibility and made honorable arrangements to correct the harm done." Isabel spoke then, her voice steadier than Charlotte had heard it since the day of her arrival. "I have told them everything, Mr. Kent. The nature of our arrangement, the debt I owe you, even the manner in which you have pursued me these past weeks. There is little left for your documents to reveal that has not already been spoken plainly within these walls." Kent looked between the three of them for a long moment, recalculating, Charlotte could see, the odds of a scheme that had suddenly become far less certain than it had appeared a fortnight before. A man who thrived on the fear of exposure found himself facing people who no longer feared it, or who had at least decided that facing it on their own terms was preferable to living beneath its constant threat. "The reduced sum," Kent said finally, his tone considerably less confident than it had been at the start of the conversation. "What figure do you propose?" Edmund named a number, considerably less than Kent's original demand, though still a genuine acknowledgement of the debt Isabel owed him. "Payable within the month," Edmund added, "in exchange for the return of any documents you hold concerning this matter, and your written confirmation that the debt is settled in full, with no further claim against either Miss Grant or this family." Kent was quiet for a long moment, and Charlotte watched him weigh the considerable difference between the sum he had originally demanded and the diminished leverage he now held, against a household that had proven far more resilient and far less fearful than he had anticipated when he first arrived at their door. "Agreed," Kent said finally, though the word came reluctantly. "I will have the documents delivered within the week, along with the written confirmation you request. I trust this concludes our business, Your Grace." "It does," Edmund said, rising to signal the meeting's end. "I would suggest, Mr. Kent, that you consider carefully before pursuing similar arrangements with other families in the future. Not every household will possess the resources or the resolve to resist your methods so directly, but those who do will remember the manner in which you conducted yourself, and I do not believe that memory will serve your business well in the long run." Kent left Marlowe House considerably less confident than he had arrived, and within the week, exactly as promised, a packet of documents arrived by messenger, along with a brief, formally worded letter confirming the debt settled and no further claim to be made. Charlotte burned the letters herself, in the small fireplace of her own parlor, watching the paper curl and blacken, until nothing remained of the correspondence that had once threatened to unravel everything she had built. The disclosure to the county families proceeded much as Charlotte had planned, delivered in careful conversations over the following weeks, framed honestly but without unnecessary detail, emphasizing the family's discretion and responsibility in resolving a difficult matter rather than dwelling on the betrayal that had caused it. There was gossip, inevitably, and Charlotte endured more than a few pointed looks and carefully veiled questions at gatherings she had once attended without a second thought. But the scandal, robbed of its power to shock through Kent's calculated timing, faded more quickly than she had dared to hope, replaced within a season by newer, fresher gossip concerning other families entirely. The most difficult conversation came first, with Lady Pemberton, an old friend of Charlotte's mother and one of the most respected voices among the county families, whose good opinion carried weight far beyond her own household. Charlotte had chosen to speak with her personally, rather than allow the news to reach her second-hand through the usual channels of servants and shared carriages, and she had done so with a directness that surprised even herself. "I will not pretend the situation reflects well on my husband," Charlotte had said, seated across from Lady Pemberton, in the older woman's drawing room, her hands folded steadily in her lap despite the nervousness she felt beneath her composed exterior. "But I would rather you hear the truth from me plainly than piece together a distorted version of it from whatever rumors eventually find their way to you." Lady Pemberton had listened without interruption, her expression giving away little until Charlotte had finished, and then she had reached across the small distance between their chairs and taken Charlotte's hand in her own. "You are a braver woman than I would have been in your position, Charlotte. Many wives would have hidden this matter entirely, or fled to their family estates rather than face it directly. I respect you a great deal for choosing honesty, difficult as it must have been." That single conversation, repeated in various forms across a dozen other drawing rooms and dinner tables over the following weeks, established a foundation that held firm, even as the news inevitably spread beyond the small circle Charlotte had chosen to inform personally. By the time distant acquaintances and casual gossips learned the full shape of the story, it arrived already softened by the accounts of those who had heard it directly from Charlotte herself, framed as a matter of family resilience rather than scandal, and the sharpest edges of judgment that might otherwise have cut deeply into the family's standing found little purchase against a narrative already claimed and shaped by the people it concerned most directly. There were, of course, those who chose to believe the harsher version regardless, who whispered behind gloved hands at assemblies and exchanged knowing glances when Edmund's name arose in conversation. Charlotte learned, in the months that followed, to hold her composure through these moments, with the same steadiness she had shown Kent in her own parlor, refusing to grant such whispers the satisfaction of visible distress. It was not always easy. There were evenings when she returned from some county gathering and wept privately in her own chamber, exhausted by the effort of maintaining dignity in the face of judgment she had not fully earned but had chosen, nonetheless, to bear alongside her husband rather than apart from him. Henry, upon learning that the matter had been resolved without his interference proving necessary or profitable, made no further attempts at blackmail, though the trust between him and Edmund never fully recovered, and his visits to Marlowe House grew considerably less frequent in the months that followed. As for Isabel, she remained at Marlowe House through the winter, no longer under a false identity, but openly acknowledged as a woman the family had chosen to protect and support in the aftermath of a difficult chapter, until she had gathered sufficient means and connections to establish a modest independence of her own in a neighboring town. She and Charlotte never became close friends in the manner of women who had known each other since girlhood, but a genuine respect had grown between them, forged in the shared danger of Kent's threat, and tempered by honest conversations neither of them had expected to have when Isabel first stepped down from that carriage. Charlotte and Edmund's marriage did not return to what it had been before the morning of Isabel's arrival, nor did Charlotte pretend, even to herself, that the deep wound of his years of deception had fully healed. But something new had grown in its place, something built not on the comfortable assumptions of earlier years, but on the harder, more honest foundation of a crisis faced and survived together. Edmund never again kept significant secrets from her, not out of fear of discovery, but out of a genuine understanding, hard-won through the fortnight of danger they had faced side by side, that his wife's strength and judgment were assets to be trusted, rather than obstacles to be managed around. Her two sons, William and young Frederick, remained largely sheltered from the details of that difficult season, though children absorbed far more of a household's atmosphere than adults often credited them with understanding. William, the elder of the two, asked her once, with the particular bluntness only a child possesses, why Miss Grant had stayed with them for so many months and then left so suddenly for a house of her own nearby. Charlotte had considered her answer carefully, choosing words that were true without burdening a boy of 9 years with complexities he was not yet ready to carry. She needed a safe place for a time, Charlotte had told him, and this family was able to offer her one. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is help someone through a difficult season of their life, even when it is not entirely convenient for us to do so. William had accepted this explanation with the easy trust of a child who had not yet learned to question his mother's account of the world, and Charlotte had felt, watching him return to his games in the garden a moment later, a fierce protectiveness toward the innocence he still carried, an innocence she and Edmund had fought hard to preserve throughout the crisis, even as it threatened to consume every other part of their lives. Frederick, younger and less inclined toward difficult questions, remembered Isabel chiefly for the small kindnesses she had shown him during her months at Marlowe House, the patient hours she had spent teaching him to sketch the birds that visited the garden hedges, the quiet afternoons reading to him when his usual governess was occupied with lessons for his brother. He asked after her occasionally still, and Charlotte always answered honestly that Miss Grant was well and settled comfortably in her own home nearby, a small truth that satisfied a young boy's curiosity without requiring the fuller explanation he was not yet old enough to receive. Edmund, for his part, had thrown himself into the management of the estate with a renewed diligence in the months following Kent's departure, as though determined to prove through steady, visible effort what he could not fully express through words alone. He consulted Charlotte on decisions he would once have made unilaterally, small matters of tenant leases and larger questions of investment and inheritance alike. And though Charlotte remained watchful of whether this new habit of consultation would prove lasting or merely a temporary response to crisis, she found, as the months passed, that it endured, becoming simply the manner in which they now conducted the business of their shared life together. There remained, of course, moments when old wounds surfaced unexpectedly, a chance mention of Bath at a dinner party that caused Edmund's expression to flicker with old guilt, or a letter from a distant acquaintance that mentioned, in passing, some rumor still circulating in more distant circles that Charlotte had not yet managed to reach with her own careful account of events. But these moments, painful as they remained, no longer carried the power to unmake the fragile peace the family had built. They were simply part of the landscape now, scars that had healed imperfectly but had healed nonetheless, reminders of a season survived, rather than wounds still actively bleeding. She did not know whether she had fully forgiven her husband, or whether such forgiveness would ever arrive in the complete and simple form she might once have imagined it, back in the early years of their marriage when she had believed such things arrived cleanly, all at once, rather than in slow, uneven fragments gathered over months of difficult effort. Forgiveness, she had come to understand, was less a single decision than a practice repeated daily, a choice she renewed each morning when she looked across the breakfast table at the man who had wronged her and chose, again, to remain rather than to leave. Not out of resignation, but out of a clear-eyed recognition of what they had rebuilt together since that difficult autumn. But she knew, standing there in the fading light, that she had faced the worst of what her marriage could reveal, and had not been destroyed by it. She had, instead, discovered a strength in herself that she suspected had always been there, waiting only for a crisis severe enough to call it forward. And she carried that knowledge now like a quiet, permanent inheritance, worth more, in its own way, than any title or estate she had married into all those years before. 2 years after Kent's final departure from Marlowe House, a letter arrived that none of them had expected, bearing a seal Charlotte did not immediately recognize and a hand she had not seen in all that time. It was from Isabel, though the tone and circumstance of it were entirely different from anything she had written during her months under the family's protection. Isabel had married a widowed gentleman of modest but respectable means, a Mr. Aldous Fairweather, who owned a small trading concern in the port town where she had settled after leaving Marlowe House, and who knew nothing of her history with Edmund beyond the carefully abbreviated account Isabel had chosen to share with him, that she had once faced financial difficulty and had been assisted, out of Christian charity, by a distant connection of good standing. The letter carried genuine warmth, an invitation for Charlotte to visit should her travels ever bring her near the coast, and a small, carefully wrapped gift for the boys, a pair of hand-carved wooden birds that Isabel wrote she hoped would remind Frederick of the sketching lessons they had once shared. Charlotte read the letter twice in the privacy of her parlor before showing it to Edmund that evening. He read it in silence, his expression unreadable for a long moment, before he finally set it down on the desk between them. "I am glad for her," he said, and Charlotte, searching his face for any trace of the old attachment that might have complicated such a statement, found instead something that looked genuinely like relief, the relief of a man finally released from an obligation he had carried, however quietly, for years. "As am I," Charlotte said, and found that she meant it fully, without the reservation she might once have expected to feel toward such news. The woman who had once represented the deepest injury of her marriage had become, in the strange alchemy of shared crisis and honest conversation, someone she genuinely wished well, and the news of Isabel's settled happiness brought Charlotte a satisfaction she would not have believed possible on that first cold morning when the carriage had arrived unannounced at her door. Charlotte wrote back within the week, a warm and detailed letter describing the boys' progress in their studies, the small triumphs and minor troubles of estate life, and an honest account of her own continued, if imperfect, contentment within her marriage. She did not travel to the coast that year, nor the year following, occupied as she was with the demands of the estate and her son's education, but the correspondence between the two women continued steadily, an unlikely friendship that had emerged from circumstances neither of them would have chosen, yet which neither of them now regretted having lived through. Henry's fortunes, meanwhile, continued their slow decline, his gambling debts mounting despite Edmund's occasional, carefully limited assistance, offered now through proper channels and reasonable terms, rather than the threats he had once attempted to leverage. Charlotte remained wary of him at family gatherings, though he never again attempted anything resembling the blackmail he had tried in the difficult fortnight following Kent's first visit, having learned, it seemed, that the family he had hoped to exploit had grown considerably less vulnerable to such tactics than he had once assumed. Kent himself, they learned through occasional reports from the solicitor who had assisted them, continued his business of collecting debts in Bath and the surrounding towns, though whispers had begun to circulate, ironically enough, of his own methods proving too aggressive for at least one family of greater standing than the Ashworths, a family that had responded to his threats not with payment, but with legal action of their own, backed by resources considerable enough to make the resulting proceedings costly and public in ways Kent had clearly not anticipated. Charlotte felt no particular satisfaction in this news beyond a quiet sense that the world occasionally arranged its justice in its own time, without requiring her family's direct involvement to see it delivered. As the boys grew older, William approaching the age where he would soon begin more formal preparation for eventually managing the estate himself, Charlotte found herself reflecting more often on the lessons of that difficult autumn, and on what she hoped her sons might carry forward from witnessing, even in their limited childhood understanding, a family that had faced genuine crisis and chosen honesty and partnership over concealment and blame. She did not speak to William directly of the full details, not yet, judging him still too young for the complete account of his father's earlier failures. But she spoke to him often, in smaller ways, of the importance of honesty in a marriage, of the danger of secrets allowed to fester rather than faced directly, lessons she delivered not as abstract moral instruction, but as observations woven naturally into the ordinary conversations of daily life, trusting that when he was old enough to understand the fuller story, he would recognize in it the truth of everything she had already tried to teach him. Edmund, for his part, had become a different sort of husband and father than he had been before that autumn, not transformed entirely, for people rarely changed so completely, but altered in the particular ways that mattered most to the daily texture of their shared life. He no longer traveled to Bath without clear purpose and full disclosure of his intentions. He no longer kept the estate's finances entirely to himself, consulting Charlotte now as a genuine partner in decisions that had once been his alone to make. And he spoke, on the rare occasions when the subject arose between them, of that difficult season with a clear-eyed honesty about his own failures that Charlotte had not always been certain he possessed the capacity for, back in the early days when his explanations had come wrapped in careful excuses rather than genuine accountability. On the second anniversary of Kent's final departure, though neither of them marked the date deliberately, Charlotte found Edmund waiting for her in the garden one evening, a small bouquet of late-season flowers gathered from the very hedgerows where she had once stood watching his carriage disappear down the drive after Kent's first unwelcome visit. He said nothing of the significance of the date, if he had even noticed it himself, but simply handed her the flowers and walked beside her along the familiar garden paths as the light faded toward evening, the two of them speaking of nothing more consequential than the boys' latest antics and the estate's harvest prospects for the coming season. It was, Charlotte thought, watching the last light catch in the turning leaves above them, precisely the sort of ordinary evening she had once feared she would never again know within this marriage, back when the carriage had first arrived and every certainty she had built her life upon had seemed, for one terrifying morning, to dissolve entirely. "Do you ever think of that morning?" she asked him, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "The carriage arriving, the household gathered at the steps. I find it strange now, looking back, how distant it feels, and yet how completely it changed the shape of everything that followed." Edmund considered the question for a long moment before answering, his eyes on the darkening tree line beyond the garden wall. "I think of it more often than I let you know," he admitted, "not with regret alone, though there is regret enough in it. I think of it too as the morning I very nearly lost everything that mattered to me through my own cowardice, and did not, only because you refused to let cowardice be the answer either of us settled for. I was not entirely without cowardice myself, in those first days," Charlotte said. "I wanted very much to simply demand she leave, to pretend the whole difficult matter could be resolved by refusing to look at it directly. It would have been easier, in the moment, than everything that followed." "Easier, perhaps," Edmund said, "but I do not think it would have served us as well in the years since. You saw further than I did, Charlotte, further than I gave you credit for seeing, if I am honest about the assumptions I carried into our marriage in its earlier years. I believed, without ever examining the belief closely, that the difficult decisions of managing danger and scandal belonged properly to me alone, that a wife's role was to manage the household and leave such matters to her husband's judgment. I do not believe that any longer." Charlotte smiled slightly at this admission, though there was no triumph in it, only a quiet satisfaction at hearing spoken aloud what she had long since come to understand through action rather than words. "It took a considerable crisis to teach you that lesson." "It did," Edmund agreed. "I confess I wish I had learned it through gentler means, but I am grateful nonetheless that I learned it at all, and that you remained patient enough, or perhaps simply determined enough, to teach it to me despite every reason you had to abandon the effort entirely. They walked in silence for a while longer, past the hedgerows now deep in shadow, toward the house where warm light glowed from the nursery windows, where William and Frederick would soon be called in from their evening games for supper and bed. Charlotte thought of the letter from Isabel still resting on her writing desk, of the friendship that had grown from such unlikely and painful beginnings, and of the strange, winding path that had carried all of them, Edmund and herself, Isabel in her distant coastal town, even Henry in his diminished and chastened circumstances, to wherever they now stood, changed by the crisis they had each, in their own way, been forced to survive. "I do not regret how it unfolded," Charlotte said finally, as they reached the edge of the garden and the warm light of the house drew nearer. "I regret the pain that led to it, certainly, and I will not pretend that pain has entirely faded, even now. But I do not regret the woman I became in facing it, nor the marriage we have built since, however imperfect it remains. I think, perhaps, that is the most honest thing I can say about any of it." Edmund took her hand as they climbed the steps toward the house, the same steps where she had once stood rigid with shock and fury as a stranger stepped down from an unfamiliar carriage, and Charlotte allowed the gesture, finding in it not the full restoration of what their marriage had once pretended to be, but something she had come to value considerably more, a partnership earned through honesty rather than assumed through habit, tested by genuine danger, and found, in the end, capable of enduring it. She did not know what further difficulties the years ahead might bring, for no marriage, however honestly rebuilt, remained entirely free of challenge. But she walked beside her husband that evening with a quiet confidence she had not possessed before that difficult autumn, the confidence of a woman who had faced the worst her circumstances could offer, and had discovered, in facing it, a strength and a partnership worth every difficult step of the journey that had led her there.